You're listening to the Australian Water Association podcast series.
My name is Peter Dredge, and joining me is Hemant Ojha. Hemant is a director at the Institute for Studies and Development Worldwide. He's also an adjunct associate professor at the University of Canberra. Welcome, Hemant.
Thank you, Peter.
So, Hemant, you're doing this review study on climate change risks to water security. Can you give me some background to the study?
Well, this study was conducted with the goal of understanding climate risk in Asia Pacific region with regard to water security. And this was designed considering the scale and intensity of impact that climate change is having. And as a result of that, the problem of water insecurity getting worse and worse. For instance, at the moment, 1.7 billion people lack basic access to water, and this number will actually rise to 5.2 billion by 2050. So the scale of water insecurity problem is quite huge in this region, and climate change is driving this insecurity. So our study had three objectives. First, to understand the intensity of risk currently as well as in future, considering the likely scenarios of climate change. And then secondly, to assess the responses that is being actually generated at the moment by different actors from local communities to national government. And then thirdly, to identify principles and strategies to move ahead. And this analysis directly speaks to SDG Goal 6, which is about ensuring water security and safe drinking water and sanitation services. And in this study, which was conducted in partnership with Australian Water Partnership here in Australia, we actually collected information from academic sources, from policy sources, from websites and other grey literatures. And we captured 12 different case studies all the way from Pakistan, came to India to pick the case of Chennai, and then taking cases, Himalayan, cases in India and Nepal, and then coming to Myanmar, to Singapore, which is one of the best examples of water resource management and water supply systems, Jakarta. And then we also picked up cases from the Pacific. So from all this information, we tried to generate some critical insights with regard to how we can manage climate risk in this Indo-Pacific region.
Can you give me an idea of the type of sources that you discovered through your searches?
That's an interesting question, Peter. I found more than 600 relevant documents, and these were coming from different categories. Yeah. One, obviously, the academic work. And then, secondly, there are quite a few international assessment work conducted by agencies like Asian Development Bank, World Bank. And then third one, these days, not surprisingly, you can find websites of every small organization, even community organizations, they have small websites and they put some updates, and this kind of podcast maintained by media and research institutes. So I actually captured a quite broad range of evidence, not just the conventional scientific evidence, but actually the whole spectrum of information that is available in the web.
And Hemant, what are some of the key findings that you want to share?
The first thing is this region is facing really, critical climate risk. There is really a scientific consensus on this finding, right? If you look at the report from World Bank, if you look at the report from United Nations, if you look at any report from IPCC, or if you look at any reports from international water research organizations, World Meteorological Organizations, and here in Australia, Bureau of Meteorology, CSIRO, So everyone is saying that, well, this region is going to face higher and higher intensity of climate risks, right? So this is one finding. And the second finding is, well, the region is not homogeneous. There are quite a few, socio-ecological regions. For instance, the Himalayan region has very different kind of climate risk. It has floods for 4 months and drought for 6 months. And if you come down to Myanmar, the dry zone of Myanmar, then it has very little rainfall and water. Although there are again big rivers passing through the region, but then technically the access to such water for small farmers is really difficult. Different countries and communities have different capabilities, to understand and respond to this risk. If you take the case of Singapore, for example, it has an excellent capability to understand the risk, to predict the risk, and then put measures in place to manage the risk. And then if you take the case of cities like Jakarta, they are struggling to protect themselves from rising sea and subsiding the land surface. And then third, and of course the final most important finding from this review is that there are whole range of responses and innovations coming up, from the local level, mostly at the local level, sometimes at sub-regional level, sometimes at country level itself. But what is lacking is those small scale innovations and positive responses are not supported, are not promoted, by national governments or international agencies well. So there are seeds of hope, coming up on the ground, but they are not adequately supported by players working at the higher level, at national and international level.
One thing, Hemant, I noted you wrote was that international players focus either on measuring risks or proposing generic solutions. Can you expand on that for me?
My point there is there is now a lot of effort by international players to develop some metrics or some framework or some sort of guideline to assess the problem and then bring the finding to global or regional or sometimes at national level. That is okay for national and regional policy processes. That knowledge is useful. But what is missing, for instance, if you take the case of farming communities in the dry zones of Myanmar, they are not benefited by regional analysis, not even a sub-regional analysis, that cover the entire river basin. They are actually, looking for analysis at community level, at farm level, at small watershed level, at a small aquifer level, that can actually support their decision making. That can actually provide critical reflections, to their thinking, right? So at the moment, the knowledge, there is a skill bias in knowledge production. Everyone is producing knowledge for the global international community, but very few people are producing knowledge for those local communities and small scale water manager and decision makers, right? So this is what I meant by that point. Yeah.
You mentioned some positive aspects of what happens in Singapore. But I'm curious, are there any other local innovations emerging that you can identify and tell us about?
Yeah, there are quite a few. If you take the case of India and Nepal, for example, there are strong community-based water management systems, both in rural areas as well as urbanizing areas, right?
Right.
And these community-based systems, they operate in collaboration with local municipal government, local rural councils. Sometimes they are supported well by provincial and national governments as well, right? And then the other one is again from India and Nepal. You can find examples of city level governments undertaking long term mapping of climate risk and then developing participatory forums to discuss both research, emerging research findings, as well as concerns of different water stakeholders in the city. And then there are basin level work also going on in different countries, supported by international players. So basin level planning work being done in Myanmar, and India and Nepal. Yeah, so this is also another area of interesting and positive innovation. And then there are also early warning systems, especially in relation to flood risk. And I have seen in India, different organizations using mobile technology to send weather forecast information through mobile, to different farmers. So those sort of things are happening actually at the local level.
Looking ahead, how do we overcome some of these barriers to good progress?
That's a very important question. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we need to downscale our knowledge making process. At the moment, we all are working at very high level, in terms of scale, national, international. And then there is also a message to national policymakers. Uh, Policy processes are driven by international support, and there is not enough interactive endogenous exercise within the country, right?
Yeah.
So international agencies can actually support local policy researchers, think tanks, policymakers to develop their own methodology that they think useful, and that way you can actually engage them in the process of knowledge making, and that way they can own the knowledge, they can utilize the knowledge, and at the moment that is not happening. And the third message is, I think we got to balance this big infrastructure thing with ecosystem, property and capability. So that requires going beyond traditional engineering and working more with nature and community to find more holistic and sustainable solutions. We require really new and innovative and transformative ways of managing water, managing climate risk. Just doing a bit of incremental thing here and there is not going to be enough. We are approaching tipping point, and if we don't fundamentally change our ways, then we will cross that tipping point and we cannot come back. So we need a strong water industry and water service sector, to
Yeah.
ensure water security for growing economy, for households, for families, for cities, and we need active role of private sector as well. We cannot just rely on communities and the government. So how do we bring all these actors and players work together to develop water service industry as well?
Well, thank you for sharing your research. I've been speaking to Hemant Ojha. Hemant is a director at the Institute for Studies and Development Worldwide and an adjunct associate professor at the University of Canberra. Thanks, Hemant.
Thank you very much, Peter.